Thank you for taking the time to watch this episode of Life Support. If you enjoy the content, we would ask that you like it, hit subscribe, and share it with your friends. Hey, really good to have you on Life Support. What we do on our podcast and on our radio show is we tell stories to help you find a deeper relationship with Jesus through suffering and trauma, because many times that's where Jesus really shows himself, and we're able to find him in a new and profound way. And I have a very special guest with us today. His name is Jim Moore. He does corrections engagement at RCCS, and he'll tell us more about that as we go along. But I'm really glad you're here.
Well,
Thanks for coming, Jim.
It's nice to be on Life Support.
Yeah, that's right. So, restoration counseling and community services.
Yes, sir.
Tell me about that.
Well, it's really something I'm passionate about. We'll get to this too. I'm a graduate of Teen Challenge, worked there for over 10 years, and primarily in the addiction field, but a lot of us have checkered backgrounds. So a lot of criminal justice involved clients. And I always kind of put addiction and criminality together, but I found in my work since then, it should be a disorder, Pastor Paul, criminogenic needs disorder. And the one place that started treating it that way is RCCS. They with the DOC, research for 20 years, the DOC did, therapeutically addressing the trauma and the underlying driving needs of criminal behavior, attitudes, and thinking. Mm-hmm. And so you got to go to prison to get that, and you got to be lucky to get it because 1% of the people get treated in prison. But RCCS is in the community. So I'm just really passionate about that because substance use, mental health, and criminogenic needs therapy, that's my passion.
Good for you.
Thank you.
You've got quite a story that led you there. And why don't you just take us back and kind of set things up? It's a tale that's difficult to talk about, I'm sure, but at the end there's Jesus.
Yeah.
So take us back. Tell us a little bit about your son and some of the things that happened that kind of sent you on a different road.
Yeah. Well, I used to be a big shot, Pastor Paul. I had a corporate lifestyle. Some people in the Twin Cities may know Larry Wilson Learning, Pecos River Learning Center. Spent part of my career was there, culture change management, not to be boastful, but a national spokesperson for them. And it was wonderful, but it was a house of cards. And I was gone most of the time. But I thought I was taking care of my family. Well, Tyler, my firstborn son, he had a lot of good things in life, but he didn't have much of me. And the tragedy hit. I raised my family a couple of miles from this church. Mm-hmm. He went to Hopkins High School, and he fell really hard to heroin and drugs. And I lost him for about 10 years. I thought he was dead and passed away. And how that impacted me is I just unraveled. It took years for the full unravel. But the psychiatrist told me that it was a traumatic catalytic event. And he said, "You've always been a little depressed, haven't you, Mr. Moore?" I said, "Well, yeah." And so he diagnosed me with chronic, profound depression, just so entrenched. So the drug addiction that I progressed into from self-medication, you know what I mean?
Yep.
Basically became that dual diagnosis, that second disorder. So I had a mental health disorder and chemical dependency disorder. It didn't get really serious until the early 2000s. I almost died of cancer. I'm a basket case, but I had a 40% chance of living.
Wow.
That kind of was another catalytic event.
Yeah.
So it got really bad mid-2000s. And I went to my pastor, and just a loving, wonderful man. And he said, "But I don't have much experience in that, Jim." But he talked to my wife and I. He counseled. He urged me to not just come to church with my family, but to seriously consider bringing Christ into my life. And he said, "Why don't you check out Minnesota Adult and Teen Challenge?" Which I'm thinking is a juvenile delinquents facility.
Yeah, right, sure.
In South.
Yeah.
And at that time,
Yeah.
I was one of the first suburban mature clients for the professional background that they had. It was mostly inner city program, folks coming out of corrections. A lot of people went to Teen Challenge as an alternative to prison. And so I wasn't sure why it was a good fit, but I was so desperate, and it was so bad, and I'd lost everything. I just, on January 1st, 2007, I went to Teen Challenge. Not for the year program. I was, in that trauma thing, you try to compromise.
Sure.
They had a 60-day program, Pastor Paul. So I said, oh, that's twice as much as the treatment I've done before. So that kind of got me in, and it was just really interesting. Those first 2 months, it takes 6 to 9 months to detox off of a chronic addiction, not 7 to 10 days. But I'm all ready after about 45 days to go home, and my second grade son said this to me. He said, Daddy, Mommy said if you do the year program, we might get to have all of you back.
Wow.
Oh. I mean, still all these years later, I just can see Jacob's face, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so I kind of wanted to, not as a prison sentence, which some people think it is, you're like institutionalized. It wasn't even a treatment program. It was like a sabbatical. Mm-hmm. And I had just gotten my first encounters with Christ. And so to me, it was a monastery. And one of the best years of my life, and based on results, because most people struggle and it's hard to stay sober, long-term chronic issues. But sober, drug-free, crime-free. I was never much of a criminal, but how can you do illegal drugs without criminal behavior?
Sure.
But and I also, instead of going back to my corporate career, which was consulting and speaking and all that, I prayed about it, and I started interning with Teen Challenge. As my mentor, my Christian mentor said, why don't you let the cement dry a little, Jim? Mm-hmm. And so I did. But after 6 months in the Leadership Institute at Teen Challenge, as an intern, they kind of started seeing that, hey, this guy's got some business acumen. And they were at that point trying to reinvent Teen Challenge. So it started a wonderful 10-year work with it. So the bottom line with Tyler is I lost him, and I guess the heart of it, Pastor Paul, is I felt I failed as a father.
So at that point, you didn't even think he was alive at that point?
I didn't. He went off to follow Jerry Garcia and the Grateful Dead. Mm-hmm. I heard from my ex-wife that she hadn't heard from him, and she thought he was gone. Well, it ended up he was in prison. And guess when I heard from him? In Teen Challenge.
Is that right, huh?
His mom gave him the number of Teen Challenge. This is many years later, and he'd been in prison for 3 years, looking at a life sentence as a career criminal. And he said, hey, Dad, do you think Teen Challenge can help me? Well, it took us a couple years. He completed prison. And then in about 2010, he came from Washington State to Minnesota, which is tough to get an interstate compact, but the Lord pulled it off. And he took Teen Challenge. It's been a rocky road.
Sure.
He still kind of struggles.
Yeah.
There's something called medication-assisted treatment, and that is whether it be, I don't know the names of all of the chemicals and drugs, but so he's on a maintenance program. But God bless him, he's sober, he found the Lord. He had known the Lord, but you can't, you're marinating for a year in Teen Challenge without drugs or non-productive influences. It was quite transformational.
Well, I've had a chance to speak a couple of times at Teen Challenges, and there's no place like it.
No,
the chapel service, I wish every believer could experience that, because to me it was like the early church probably was. There's an incredible freedom.
Yeah.
The love that's there, the way they there's just a freedom to worship. It's pretty amazing, and you can feel the power of the Holy Spirit there. And I'm a big believer in Teen Challenge. We're fortunate to have them drop by every year here.
Oh,
and
you do?
Yeah. So it's
well,
pretty cool.
I may have passed through in 2007.
You may definitely have. So when you experienced this with Tyler, and you said that hit you hard because you felt like you were...
I failed as a father.
Yeah. Tell me how you grappled with that and what God has kind of led you through in that process.
Well, it must be in some way similar to those folks who lose a child maybe from an opioid overdose or something like that. But just something broke inside of me, Pastor. It was like imploding. And it was so funny because I'd been so successful with groups and working with people. It just started it took a couple of years, but it all started slipping away. The psychiatrist said it was a social anxiety disorder. And I couldn't lead a group in silent prayer, as a result of that. So it was that gradual descent into hell, in a way, on earth. And I had some younger sons from my second marriage, and I was less and less of a father to them. And it was just that slow slide.
And at this point, you didn't have the hope of Christ, so you're kind of grappling with this on your own?
I had, throughout my life, because my mother was really spiritual, I had this deep love for God. I knew there was something there. I took some philosophy classes in college. And
that takes courage, by the way, to do that.
Christ was one of those we studied.
Is that right?
And here's what struck me, because I dove into it. Of all the great philosophers, the red ink from the Bible, even for a college student in the 60s, right? That environment, there was something about what he said that was totally, to me, distinct from the others. So here's what I realized, or what I decided. He's the greatest teacher that ever lived. That's where he was in my heart.
Wow.
But it wasn't until I was totally shattered that I got to meet him. So I don't recommend drug addiction as a pathway to salvation, but it worked for me, Pastor.
Praise God for that.
I think I was so prideful. I needed to be shattered, and I was when I went into Teen
So was
Challenge.
it shame then that was driving that whole descent, or were there just many different things coming together all at once that...
Yeah, I don't know the shame, because that would be kind of externally focused on other people.
Mm-hmm.
I think it was more a soulful sense of failing at the most important thing in my life. And just, the feeling of a parent to a child.
Yeah.
Just that, consumed by that guilt, maybe.
Yeah, guilt.
Guilt would be probably how Satan got a hold of my throat,
Yeah. And so at this point, you didn't know where Tyler was. All you knew is that he went to follow Jerry Garcia.
Yeah, and they ended up in California somewhere.
Okay. And then has he filled you in since then about those whole period of time, or are you still...
Oh, yeah, because, once he came to Teen Challenge, he's living back in California now, but he lived here for 4 or 5 years. I did the old let the cement dry, as my mentor would say. Mm-hmm. And so, we got to know it deeply. He got very heavy into gang life and addiction in California. That's where he got the career criminal thing kind of going. I remember him talking about race wars and black folks. And, he had this SS kind of tattoo. So, it was just kind of weird, those attitudes that had entrenched themselves in him, So he had he just immersed himself in the dark side of criminality. He said there's things he wasn't going to tell me because they were just too bad. So, I wasn't pressing. I knew that it was really, really bad. And I knew that he was back.
What did that feel like when you discovered that he was still alive and that he had reached out to you?
Oh, you're going to make me cry. The absolute opposite feeling times 10. Just to know he was alive. And then over the next year or two, when he actually made it to Teen Challenge, and then a year later, I got to be on the stage with him. I don't know if you've ever been to a Teen Challenge graduation.
No, I'm not.
Oh, you want to see something. They were open to the public. And Tyler and I were up on stage. And he gave me my life back. He gave me my son back. Mm-hmm. It was just that emotional, moving, oh gosh, something I had prayed for and I hoped for, but I never really thought would come. And then when it did, it was so surreal. And it still is. It was a miracle. I mean, how many times does someone get to experience a unadulterated, couldn't possibly happen, you know what I mean, miracle around something that's one of the most important things of your life?
Wow. So how did he know you were in Teen Challenge?
My ex-wife in Seattle.
Is that right?
Yeah, I had heard from somebody who heard from somebody, that I was. And so, she would visit him in prison in Washington State. And so it was, that's how he found out. The other funny thing is they never let you answer a phone call at Teen Challenge, but not on that day.
Wow.
The program staff, God bless them, brought the cell phone to my room and said, somebody wants to talk to you. And it was from prison in Washington State.
And there he was.
Wow. Yeah.
And so as you reflect back on that period of time when you were really, when you didn't think that was going to happen, you were kind of descending, you're struggling, you're falling into addiction, was there any sense of what God might be doing, or if he was involved with you at all at that point? Or was it so far removed from you at that time that you were just totally lost?
I was lost. I mean, this is a pre-Teen Challenge. Tried a couple treatments. I thought they were like cancer. You get surgery, you get chemotherapy.
You get better. And
then I kept relapsing. And so it got really, really hopeless. One of my beloved sons called me a pathetic old man. And so I'd lost my younger sons kind of in all of that. And something I didn't mention, and I don't talk about a lot, but it came to a point where I pulled over down by the Lake Street Bridge, and I was going to jump off the bridge. This would have been before Christmas, maybe 2006. And then I kind of hid in the back of the van and took a nap. And I've told people nobody came. No dead poets, no great philosophers. But it's somebody was in the van. How do you explain that? And I remember as I was contemplating this feeling came over me. I can still feel it. Is, Jim, if you jump off that bridge, they're not going to be better off without you. It will be the most selfish thing you have ever done. So I fell asleep, and the next morning I went home and confessed to my family my drug addiction. I was down to 160 pounds, and they thought it was the chemo and the depression. And people in Hopkins freaked. Jim Moore, I mean, Little League coach, Glen Lake Park. The word gets out that I was a cocaine addict. Some of my son's children's friends' parents wouldn't let them play with them. They were ostracized. Just not a lot of that exploded in Hopkins, at least back at that time, right? And so, anyway, I've started rambling and
no, you're doing track of no. This is an amazing. It's an amazing story.
That's why I love a pastor to guide me.
But you were in the van, and you felt like God or something was, at least at that point, you weren't sure who that was. Now you know who that was.
I was pretty sure at the time that it was Jesus. I mean, it just.
But that's so not church culture these days. We don't talk about miracles. We aren't expecting miracles. Yeah. We kind of go by what we see, and here you are experiencing. Yeah. I mean, that was not even the miracle that you experienced with your son. That was even before that. And so God was already at work. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I have had cancer twice now, and almost suicide, chronic drug addiction, gosh, a couple others. I should be dead or in prison, Pastor, 10 times over. Now, are we talking a miracle there? And look at me. I'm a good person. I'm still emotional. I don't do meds anymore for the depression. I talked to my psychiatrist, and I said, as someone once said, it's the pain of too much tenderness. I like these feelings. And in Christ, those deep emotional feelings, they're purposeful.
Yeah, don't lose that ever.
No. And the medication, I mean, medication is an important thing to stabilize.
Sure.
But I had gotten so medicated that I'm about 6 months into Teen Challenge, and I'm praying, and there's this zzz. So I went to my psychiatrist, and I said, I think it's the Wellbutrin. I'd like you to wean me off of it. And Christ is working with me. And he smiled, and this is what he said. I'm glad you brought up Christ. I'm a Christian, Jim.
Wow.
And I can't bring it up unless you do.
Wow.
And he said, let's do this. Let's just take you off the meds for 2 weeks and see what happens. If the depression comes back, we'll get you back on it. So guess what happened 2 weeks later? The depression came back, but it came back different. These deep, emotionally, easily moved to tears, a depth I'd never known before. So as long as I stay sober and close to Christ, it's one of the greatest blessings of my life. I think it's the heart of Christ in me.
Yeah.
You know, because he had a lot of heart. Amen.
Oh, yeah.
He had sadness. I remember the first verse I memorized. Yeah. Jesus wept.
Well, he looked back on Jerusalem and his heart was broken. And don't ever lose that. We've got
no, and I don't want to medicate it away or drug it away.
No.
But we have a heart. Drugs,
we need more heart in our churches. We need people like you,
and passion and vulnerability.
Yeah.
But just so folks know that the drugs, I think, are Satan's way. I'm not a Satan kind of thing, but the drugs really corrupt that feeling. Because I'd always been, I think, a deep emotional person, and it was part of why I was effective as a speaker and a group facilitator.
Sure.
But it was so corrupted by the drugs into this toxic despair. And without drugs and with Christ, I love my children and all that, but I don't love anything like him and me.
Yeah, good for you.
I mean, above all and all else, and not even in a competitive way.
Yeah.
It's like, no. It's not a competition because there's nothing like him.
It's your driving force in your life.
Exactly.
Now.
Yeah, and it has been for 15 years now.
Wow. Well, we haven't even scratched some of the surface of this, so I hope you come back next time. And it's very brave to tell your story, and I really appreciate you doing that. So we'll look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks a lot, Jim.